Why don't you come up here and show these good people from Allen, Texas, the way you kick ass back in Washington, D.C.
Madam President, I intend to speak in opposition to Obamacare until I'm no longer able to stand. What the focus should be is on making Washington, D.C. listen to the American people and respond to the very real harms that Obamacare is causing millions of people.
Now, over in Tea Party la-la land,
Cruz trying to get Obamacare defunded and so on, even when most of his party think he's crackers.
what you were doing makes no sense.
My friend from Texas is like the schoolyard bully.
Not in a box, not with a fox. Not in a house, not with a mouse. I would not eat them here or there. I would not eat them anywhere. I would not eat green eggs and ham. I do not like them. Sam, I am. If standing for liberty and standing for the Constitution makes you a whack-a-bird, then count me a proud whack-a-bird.
Famous Republican politician I've seen in the last 30 years.
The Empire will strike back.
It is very clear there will be consequences.
But at the end of the day, I think the Rebel Alliance, I think the people will prevail. God bless Collin County. And God bless Texas. Now, everyone have a seat. I want you guys just to imagine Bill Whittle negotiating on behalf of the United States of America with the Iranian mullahs. Now let me just ask you, how quick do you think it would be before they padlocked and shut down those centrifuges? I'll also note that little clip, which I didn't know was going to be played, that actually contained a bit of an homage to Mr. Which is, if you go online and see the many things he's done, he has, when he talks about Republicans needing to be rebranded, sometimes he talks about the fact that we sound often like a whole bunch of accountants with green eye shades looking at our shoes. And by the way, you know how you tell an accountant who's an extrovert? He looks at your shoes when he's talking to you. But what Bill has said is, look, Republicans, we don't know how to sell conservative values. We ought to be talking to people, and he's drawn the Star Wars analogy. We are fighting against the empire, this oppressive regime. And this is a rebel alliance of people who are standing up for freedom. But you know what? It's too much for you. Don't worry about it. That's too much for you. He paints that picture, and so that homage of the alliance will prevail was actually in the middle of the filibuster, was referencing Mr. Whittle, and indeed I turned to my good friend Mike Lee and said, we are standing against the empire here. And indeed, any minute now, I'm expecting a large man in a black metal breathing apparatus to walk in and say, Mike Lee, I am your father. So that was inspired by Bill. Now, I'll tell you, the last week or so, it's been pretty cold. It's been really cold. I mean, look, Al Gore told us it wasn't going to happen. 2 weeks ago, I am told that President Obama said he will admit Obamacare is a disaster when hell freezes up. And then last week, Washington, D.C. was covered in ice. It was so cold, I could have sworn I saw a Democrat with his hands in his own pockets. I also want to take a moment to apologize if there are any Alabama football fans here. I feel obliged to do that because I was coming here. This is a place of worship, and yet Alabama football fans are being forced to gaze at field goal posts and relive that Auburn game. And so I'm sorry. That's a hard thing for any Alabama fans. Well, I'm thrilled y'all are here. And I can promise you one thing. I will do my very, very best to speak for under 21 hours. You will know I'm nearing the end if and when I begin to read from the Cat in the Hat. But listen, I gotta be honest, 21 hours is a long time. I mean, it's really a long time. I mean, that's almost as long as it takes to sign up on the Obamacare website. It is great to be back in North Texas, to be here with so many friends. I want to recognize my friend Congressman Michael Burgess. Michael, where are you? I'll tell you, back during the Senate campaign, when nobody in their right mind said we had a prayer, Michael stuck his neck out and endorsed our campaign and said we got to do something different in Washington. Michael, you're a principled, courageous man. And I also want to take a minute to say something about my good friend, Ken Paxton. Ken has represented a great many of the men and women in this room for over a decade, both in the State House and in the State Senate. And I'll tell you, the scriptures tell us, you shall know them by their fruit. And Ken has been standing up over and over again, fighting for conservative principles in Austin. He has stood up and fought to pass voter ID laws. He has stood up and fought against Obamacare, and he has stood up to fight to defend our religious liberty. And Ken, I'm proud to call you my friend. You're a strong, powerful conservative leader. What I want to do tonight, more than anything else, is share a word of encouragement. A word of encouragement to everyone here, because, look, these are not typical times in politics. The challenges facing this country are not ordinary challenges, and yet I will tell you, I am profoundly, profoundly optimistic. If you remember nothing I say tonight, well, they may have spiked the drinks in the back. If you remember just one thing I say tonight, remember this, that I am incredibly optimistic despite all of the threats we are facing. We, the people, are going to turn this country around. I want to talk to you about three things. Number one, liberty is under assault. Liberty is under assault in this country like never before. We have a president, we have an administration, it seems like they're going down the Bill of Rights, trying to violate them one at a time. You look at the First Amendment, this is an administration that consistently has refused to respect and has violated religious liberty, especially the religious liberty of the brave men and women fighting in our military. You look at the Second Amendment. Vice President Joe Biden. You know the nice thing? You don't need a punchline. You just say his name. I promise, try it. Go to a cocktail party. Be sitting there, just look at someone and say, Vice President Joe Biden. They will crack up laughing. But Vice President Joe Biden said, if someone attacks your house, just go outside with a double-barreled shotgun, fire both barrels in the air. Now that is very, very good advice. If it so happens you're being attacked by a flock of geese. But you know what? This is the most anti-Second Amendment administration and president we've ever seen in our nation. You look at the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, the rights of privacy of every American. How many of y'all have your cell phones? I'm going to ask each of you, please, leave your cell phones on. I want to make sure President Obama hears every word we have to say. But you know, every bit as worrisome as the assault on the Bill of Rights is the consistent pattern of lawlessness from this president and this administration. The contempt for rule of law. You know, this administration began early on by the president decreeing a moratorium on offshore drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. Had no legal authority to do so. A federal court struck it down, said this is contrary to law. What did they do? He reimposed it right after that, ignored the federal court. On Monday, 2 days from now, U.S. Supreme Court is going to be hearing a case challenging the appointments the president named to the National Labor Relations Board. Now, the Constitution says the president can make appointments, the Senate confirms them. It also has an exception. If the Senate's in recess, the president can get around that confirmation. Well, President Obama did something that 43 presidents before him had never done. He said, the Senate's not in recess, but I say they are. I'm appointing them. No confirmation. 3 federal courts of appeals have struck down the president's appointments as unconstitutional. And this administration is just ignoring the courts. It is openly flouting and defying the courts. You know, you look at what this administration has said in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. In the last 2 years, 9 separate times this administration has argued for overbroad federal authority. 9 separate times it's been rejected unanimously. The Obama administration argued in front of the U.S. Supreme Court that the government should be able to put a GPS tracker on any American's car with no warrant, no probable cause, no articulable suspicion. You know, there is that Fourth Amendment thing. But according to this administration, doesn't have anything to say about putting GPS on cars. If this administration had its way, they could be out in the parking lot right now putting GPSs on all of our cars. Although in Texas, we have a check against that, called a gun rack. U.S. Supreme Court unanimously rejected that proposition, said, of course, Americans have a right to be free from the government monitoring everywhere they go. This administration also, in another case called Hosanna Tabor, made an argument, you know, we're standing in a church today. This administration went in front of the U.S. Supreme Court and said the First Amendment has nothing to say about whether a church has the authority to hire their own pastors, hire their own teachers. There's no First Amendment protection whatsoever. Justice Elena Kagan, who was appointed by Barack Obama, famed right-wing kook Elena Kagan, said from the bench in the U.S. Supreme Court, when the Department of Justice attorney argued the First Amendment doesn't protect religious liberty of churches to hire their own pastors and teachers, she said, I find what you're saying amazing. That's his own judicial appointee saying it is amazing that the U.S. Department of Justice would go into court and say the First Amendment doesn't protect our most fundamental religious rights. This ought to worry every American. And you know, if you look across the terrain of lawlessness, there is no greater embodiment of lawlessness than this administration's enforcement or non-enforcement of Obamacare. You know, the president loves to say Obamacare is the law of the land. Then why won't he follow it? You know, the law of the land, Obamacare, says in its text that the employer mandate will kick in for big business on January 1st, 2014. The president said, no, it won't. Now, I don't know how many of y'all remember your junior high civics class. I don't know how many of y'all remember Schoolhouse Rock. You remember how a bill becomes a law? Now, in the quaint old days, it used to be that if a law says the following mandate kicks in on January 1st, 2014, that it in fact kicked in on January 1st, 2014, unless you went to Congress and changed it. President Obama invented a new way. He had a mid-level bureaucrat at the Department of Treasury put up a blog posting on July 3rd, before the 4th of July break, that simply announced he was unilaterally granting an exemption to all big business. This portion of the law will not be followed until 2050, unless he changes his mind in 2050. And we'll have to wait and see. Another example, a portion of the Obamacare law explicitly says members of Congress shall be subject to Obamacare, shall be on the Obamacare exchanges without subsidies, just like millions of other Americans. Only problem is Harry Reid, a whole bunch of Democratic senators, met with President Obama on Capitol Hill, and they were upset. They said, listen, we followed Nancy Pelosi's advice. We passed it, and we found out what's in it. This thing is terrible. The president said, don't worry, I got your back. I got your back. And with the wave of a hand, he exempted members of Congress. Never mind what that pesky little law says. We're just not going to enforce that. And you know, most strikingly, as we've seen Obamacare melting down, the most tragic consequences of it have been the over 5 million people whose health insurance has already been canceled because of Obamacare. And it's illustrated to people all over the country that when Barack Obama stood up and said, if you like your health insurance plan, you can keep it, period. Well, if you read the New York Times, well, that's your first mistake. But the New York Times said when he said that, he, quote, misspoke. You know, there comes a time, Kathy, where you can't make this up. And you cannot make fun of the left-wing media. You simply can repeat what they say. So, according to the New York Times, President Obama misspoke 28 separate times when he said word for word the exact same thing, looking in the television camera, reading the teleprompter to the American people. And it just so happened it was deliberately, repeatedly false. So, it's kind of a political problem then when people realized the prior statement was no longer operative. So, going back to the civics class, the old way you used to do it. If a law's not working, you go back and say, okay, let's go to Congress and fix it. Now, the president had a whole new way to do it. He held a press conference. He held a press conference at the White House and he announced to insurers, I am instructing you to violate the law. By the way, the reason those 5 million plus people have lost their health insurance, it's not an unintended consequence. Obamacare says, we, the federal government, don't like the health insurance policy you have and you like. And so it is illegal. That's why they're canceled, because Obamacare makes their policies illegal. And what does the president say? I am instructing the American people I am instructing private citizens, insurers, violate the law. You know, some of us may think if you want to know what the law is, you go look at the United States Code, at the actual thing that was passed. He says, no. All of you are instructed to violate the law for 1 year. Unless I change it. You know, this is not an issue about right or left. This is not an issue about conservative or Republican. To be honest, there ought to be Democrats lining up. If we had anything resembling an actual impartial media, they ought to be lining up, because I'll tell you what, if you have a president who can pick and choose what laws to follow, then you no longer have a president. Liberty is under assault. It's the second thing I want to tell you. Second thing I want to tell you is opportunity is under assault. You know, this past week, President Obama is talking about income inequality. I think that's great. I think it is very fitting that he's talking about income inequality. Why? Because under President Obama, income inequality has increased dramatically. His policies have dramatically increased income inequality. Single biggest lie in politics is the lie that Republicans are the party of the rich. Here's the dirty little secret that you'll never see on the nightly news. The rich do just fine with big government. Big business does great with big government. They have armies of lobbyists and lawyers and accountants. They get special deals, and they do just fine. Do you know that today, the top 1%, the millionaires and billionaires the president loves to demigod, earn a higher share of our national income than at any time since 1928? That's the result of the Obama policies. But look, hey, 1928, nothing bad happened after that. Don't worry about it. The people who are hurt by the Obama economy, the people who are hurt by $1.7 trillion in new taxes, by job-killing regulations, are the little guys. The people who are hurt are the people who are struggling because small businesses are getting pounded into oblivion. And 2/3 of all new jobs come from small businesses. You know, an awful lot of y'all here know my father, Cruz. Now, my dad is very, very shy and soft-spoken. And my hope is in time we can just get him to come out of his shell. But, you know, I try to think of every challenge we face as I'm facing issues in the U.S. Senate from the perspective of 56 years ago. 56 years ago, in 1957, was when my father arrived from Cuba. Arrived from a prison cell in Cuba, coming here for freedom. He was 18, and he was washing dishes, making 50 cents an hour, seeking the American dream. And you know what? If my dad were washing dishes today, the odds are very, very high he would have lost that job. Because of the crushing taxes, because of the crushing regulation, because of the war on small business these last 5 years. If he were somehow lucky enough not to have lost his job, the odds are almost 100% he would have been forced to work 28, 29 hours a week, because the threshold for Obamacare is 30 hours. And you know what? You can't feed your kids, you can't feed your family, you can't pay your way through school on 28, 29 hours a week. The people who have been hurt the most by the Obama economy are the most vulnerable among us. Young people, Hispanics, African Americans, single moms. People who are working to achieve the American dream. Opportunity is threatened. How do we turn it around? We get back to the policies that have worked over and over again in our nation's history. Rein in spending, rein in debt, tax reform, reg reform. We need to abolish the IRS. We need to repeal Dodd-Frank. We need to audit the Federal Reserve. And we need to repeal every single word of Obamacare. Now, some of y'all may be thinking, all right, Cruz said he was optimistic, he was going to be encouraging. And he's talked about how liberty is under assault, the administration is utterly lawless, and opportunity is crumbling. Boy, this guy's pretty peppy. Well, I'm going to tell you why I am so optimistic. And that is the third point I want to make, which is the American people, and only the American people, can and will turn this country around. In the last couple of years, we have seen something extraordinary, something transformative, which almost none of the media coverage has mentioned. We have seen the rise of the grassroots. We've seen it here in Texas, on the ground. You want to know why I'm optimistic? You want to know why I'm inspired? You inspire me. My friend Katrina Pearson inspires me. She is a principled conservative fighter who is utterly fearless. My friend Connie Burton inspires me. Connie Burton wakes up every day fighting for liberty and fighting for every Texan. God bless you. My friend Maggie Wright inspires me. Maggie has a passion for freedom that bursts out of her heart. My friend Kathy Adams inspires me. Kathy is willing to speak the truth, no matter the price. My friend Lyle Land inspires me. Lyle has worked thousands of hours spreading the message of freedom. What's happening in Texas is happening all over this country. Look at this past year. Look at 2013. Early in the year, right when I got to the Senate, one of the very first fights I was honored to be a part of was standing side by side with my friend Senator Rand Paul in his epic filibuster on drugs. What happened with that is the American people saw what he was doing, began speaking up for liberty. It was astonishing. As the night went on, as it got into the evening, you saw senators who'd been in office 20, 30 years rushing back to the floor of the Senate from home. And they walked in and they're sort of, I don't know what's happening, but my staff said the Tweety thing is exploding. That's my cousin cracking up. The American people spoke up. And the next day, President Obama was forced to do what he refused to do for 3 consecutive weeks, which is admit the Constitution limits his authority to target U.S. citizens. A couple months later, we saw it on guns. We're following the horrific shooting in Newtown, Connecticut. All of Washington was convinced President Obama's anti-gun agenda was unstoppable. Until the American people began speaking up in overwhelming numbers and telling their elected representatives, listen, violent criminals, come down on them like a ton of bricks. But protect the constitutional right to keep and bear arms of every law-abiding American. And when it came time for a vote, every single one of President Obama's proposals that would have undermined the Second Amendment was voted down. A few months later, we saw the president on Syria announce that he intended to launch a unilateral military strike. And the immediate reaction is we had bipartisan leaders from both houses of Congress say they agree. The consensus in Washington was that was unstoppable. And then the American people spoke up in incredible numbers and said, we don't want to send our sons and daughters to get in the middle of a sectarian civil war between Sunnis and Shiites, where we have no clear, discernible U.S. national security interest in the fight. I'll tell you, in our offices, the calls on Syria were literally 99.95 to 1. All of Washington was convinced a unilateral military strike was unstoppable, and the American people rose up and said, stop. And the most powerful demonstration of it last year was the fight over defunding Obamacare. We saw over 2 million Americans sign a national petition to defund Obamacare and then melt down the phones at Capitol Hill. I cannot tell you how many of my colleagues pounded the table and said, my constituents, they keep calling me. Now, the mainstream media has explained to us that the effort to stop Obamacare was a total failure. They said it has permanently hurt Republicans. Really? You know, the interesting thing is we don't have to argue hypothetically. The proof is in the pudding. Right now, today, President Obama is at his lowest approval rating he has ever been in 5 years in office. Right now, Obamacare is at its lowest approval it has ever been since the day it passed. Right now, Obamacare is becoming wildly unpopular with young people. Right now, Obamacare is becoming wildly unpopular with independents. In fact, astonishingly, outside of Washington, D.C., right now, Obamacare is becoming unpopular with Democrats. If you want to have a barometer for where the country is, turn on your late night television. Look at someone like, say, Jay Leno. Last fall, Jay Leno said, So President Obama called me. He said, Jay, if you like your job, you can keep it. A couple weeks later in November, Leonard went back to the thing. He said, so, the holidays are upon us. Thanksgiving. You know, the first Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims said to the Indians, if you like your land, you can keep it. This thing ain't working. And what we are doing, what the fight that began last summer has done, is elevated the debate and made clear to every American that Obamacare is a disaster and it's got to be repealed. You know, one of the things I'm trying to do is tell the stories of people all over this country. We've launched a national website, MakeDCListen.org. MakeDCListen.org. Let me encourage every one of you, go to MakeDCListen.org and upload your stories. Upload your story of how Obamacare is impacting your life, how it's impacting your job, how it's impacting your family. You can get on your phone and record a video and upload it straight onto the website. Because on one level, you could look at what's happening. You can look at the threats to our liberty. You can look at the threats to opportunity. And you can be demoralized. But I want to tell you, and this is how I want to wrap up. The book of Ecclesiastes tells us there's nothing new under the sun. Where we are today reminds me a great deal of the late 1970s. Late 1970s, you had economic stagnation and malaise. You had the same misguided economic policies out of control. Taxes, spending, and regulation produced the exact same misery. You had the same feckless foreign policy that made the world a more dangerous place and undermined our national security. And I gotta say, the only person happy things have gone so bad is Jimmy Carter. And you know, it speaks volumes. You don't have to explain why Carter's happy. And what happened in the late 1970s? All across this country, we saw first hundreds, and then thousands, and then millions of men and women form a grassroots movement that became the Reagan Revolution, that swept this country. The answers are not going to come from Washington, D.C. They're not going to come from a bunch of politicians who've been in office a long, long time. The answers are going to come from the American people. And the reason I am optimistic and inspired is we're seeing that happen all over Texas and all over this country. We saw what the grassroots can do on drones. We saw what the grassroots can do on guns. We saw what the grassroots can do on Syria. When the American people stand up and hold our elected officials accountable, it scares the living daylights out of them. And liberty is never safer than when politicians are terrified. So that's why I'm inspired. I'm inspired because of each of you, because together, if we keep standing up, we're going to pull this country back from the fiscal and economic cliff. We're going to pull this country back from the abyss, back to the free market principles that are the foundation of this country, back to the Constitution that protects the freedom of every American. That's what we're doing together. And I am honored and profoundly humbled to work for each one of you and to be shoulder to shoulder with you in the foxhole, fighting to restore that shining city on a hill that is the United States of America. Thank you, and God bless you.